This video explores the question, what does a historian do? If you are not quite sure how to answer this question, well, you are not alone. In fact, when researcher Dr. Jeffrey Noakes asked the same question to a group of students, their answers were as follows: search Wikipedia, watch history documentaries, and listen to history lectures. Answers that reflected what those students did in their history classes. Dr. Noakes concluded that in no subject is there a greater gap between the work of professionals and how that subject is taught in schools. Noakes explained that in science, students do labs. In gym class, they play sports. In English class, they write poetry, and in industrial arts, they work with the same tools carpenters use. But in history, the main activities are listening to lectures and memorizing information. So what then does a historian do? Dr. Sam Weinberg, a professor at Stanford University, answered this question by studying and observing a group of historians. The rest of this video will explain what he found and why you, as a history student, should care. Rather than sitting around reading history textbooks and watching documentaries all day in order to be able to spout off unnecessary historical facts at a moment's notice, historians actually create history by studying and interpreting artifacts, often called sources, left from the past. These sources can include written records, as well as physical artifacts left behind, such as weapons, buildings, and tools. The historian will take these sources and piece them together like a puzzle to create a narrative of what happened. There are often many different accounts of the past, telling different stories about the same event or person. This happens because historians might not have access to the same source as other historians, or because they might interpret the same source differently from one another. So if historians just create history, how can I trust anything they say? Well, just like a scientist uses a scientific method to solve problems, historians use a set of problem-solving skills to create an account of the past. The three main skills used by historians are sourcing, corroboration, and contextualization. The first skill used by historians is sourcing. Before a historian looks at a historical source, they ask themselves the following: who wrote this? What is the author's perspective? Why was it written? When was it written? Where was it written? And is it reliable? A historian will ask these questions to determine if the source is good. For example, a source telling about what happened in the continental United States on July 4th, 1776, written by an 8th grade student more than 200 years later after the event, would not be a good source if a historian was trying to write an account of what happened on that day. On the other hand, a journal account from Thomas Jefferson, written on the very same day, would be a much better and more reliable source to determine what happened on that day. The second skill used by historians is corroboration. Corroboration means looking at and comparing several sources to get a better picture of what happened in the past. A historian will look at how multiple sources describing the same event or person are similar or different. By looking at multiple sources, a historian can get a better idea of what happened. If there is a consensus among many sources, then a historian can better conclude what happened in the past. More sources also represent different perspectives on an event and thus could provide a better picture of the past. And finally, by looking at more than one source, a historian may be led to ask more questions about the past. The third skill used by historians is contextualization. Contextualization requires a historian to question the circumstances in which a source was created and how that might impact the context of the source. For example, understanding that a source describing what happened in a battle was written by a general to his commanding officer will help us understand why the general described the battle the way he did. So why should you as a student care what a historian does? Well, as your teacher, I want to teach you things that you will actually use in your life. And I know that as students, you want to learn things that you will actually use in your life as well. Now, you are not likely to use the knowledge that George Washington was the 14th Chancellor of the College of William and Mary, or that the Wall of China was built in the 7th century BC by the Chu state. However, you will use the skill of sourcing, corroboration, and contextualization almost every day. Let's say you come across an interesting news article, either on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. It tells you some really interesting facts about two prominent politicians that you didn't know. Before you accept the information as truth, you should source it. Find out who wrote it, why it was written, and for what purpose. This will help you determine if the information is true, partially true, or downright false. As for when you might use the skills of corroboration or contextualization, I will leave that up to you to figure out. Your assignment is to post on the class discussion board how you might use the skills of corroboration, contextualization in your everyday lives and provide examples for both.